So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is your Talk Architecture podcast host, Naziaty Muhammad Yaacob, again with you on another episode, a run up of a series of podcasts before the 1st of January 2024, recapping and dissecting some of the issues that have been brewing of late, such as this one. Now, the newspaper article that we are talking about here is in the Malay language. And before I would go into this, I'd just like to explain that this podcast episode is based on my comment on this article and beyond. When we talk about the issue of architectural identity or the lack of it in a country or in a city, such as this is based in Malaysia and in particular Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia. Although the administrative capital is Putrajaya, that's another story altogether. But here we're looking at Kuala Lumpur and how the identity is based on the forms of the building, or how the form of the building is being identified with, and the lack of identity. Is it that it needs to have some Malaysian identity or characteristics to it? This is old story, because in the 1980s, we already tried to debate this. That's the postmodern movement, the 1980s, when it was natural to go and review the modern movement buildings and the buildings of the late modernism, and looking at that and wanting to have more of the regional identity of the place. And there were buildings like the Bank Bumiputra and other buildings came and was designed and built to look like a replica of the Malay traditional house. So now why is it that this article is emerging again? Well, maybe it's to do with also the sentiments of the time, but let us dissect that later. What I'd like to actually talk is at first is my opinion on this piece, which has to do with all that I've said, most of what I said earlier, especially in the article, in the podcast entitled When and Why Did Architecture Isolate Itself as a Profession? Eisenman versus Alexander, part 2. And there was part 1 and part 3 as well. But in that particular episode, which has the most download, that explains quite a bit about this issue, in which the architect's design approach is the obvious factor for the lack of identity. And I'm not talking about forms. The best is to design using the method of the site-specific approach. It is back to the debate on designing for harmony or disharmony based on urban and architecture theory, and the debate between Eisenman and Alexander in 1982 is still relevant. So you could go back to this podcast, which I will leave the link below, and you can actually understand where I'm coming from with regard to the design approach, and hence the loss of identity. The thing is, identity is always to do with form. But identity is not always to do with form. In fact, it's less to do with form, actually, than anything else. But that is from my point of view, which, of course, many of you would disagree. But obviously, let's open our hearts and minds and try to think about this a bit more beyond form. I will go into that article, which I will translate on the spot so that you could understand the sentiment that is coming from. Most notably, it is not from an architect. It was an architect who wrote that article, which is an article in the Malay language. So I'd like to add a few things more before I go in there. One is that the second point, the lack of the profession of urban designers and the pigeonholing of roles in the profession of architecture and planning. There are two professions here, but there is not a pronounced or a real tangible and meaningful way of discussing about urban design, particularly because in architecture schools, it is not really in the curriculum, in the master's level. And even it was more like urban context rather than urban design. It's not really looking into the design problems in terms of the horizontality of the place, but more of vertical, meaning more of high rise, meaning of building complex. It doesn't look at how the relationship of different building clusters or different sites and rows and people, going around and about. There is urban design courses in some of the schools of architecture, but it is more to do with the principles of urban design. It's not to do with other issues like social, cultural context, that even economic context, even other contexts that we could pick up with that could be very complex indeed. So because there is this bent on having more of high rise, more of building complexities vertically, that schools of architecture has not dealt with the identity issue in urban design. Now, planners cannot design, but that don't mean they cannot pick up design sensibilities when it comes to the debate that local authorities are the one at fault. No, it's not local authorities at fault. It is the profession at fault. And it's not planning profession is at fault. It is the fact that there is no urban designers in the middle of architecture and planning, and that these different roles in the profession, in the built environment profession, architecture and planning, are on their own. Okay, so who's going to pick up on urban design? So the problem is that we train our architects at university, especially at master's level, where it is possible to explore master planning and urban design, collaborating with local authorities. And we did that. When I was employed in a university, we did a couple of times for the design thesis. For the design thesis, not the fourth year project, in 2018 to 2020, looking into Kampong Kerinci and PJ Old Town. Actually, we presented to Kuala Lumpur City Hall or DBKL and Petaling Jaya City Council, which is MBPJ. Those sites were controlled by these local authorities, and we learned from each other. I mean, the local authorities, the councillors, they would say something as well during these sessions. And it helps to build the architecture profession to be concerned of towns and cities. The architecture profession starts with the architecture graduates, the younger people, to learn what it is urban design, for example, and that buildings are not built in silos or just around it. Buildings are built in their boundaries. No, buildings are affecting each other, like in urban design. So, also, this is to design more. The idea is also to design more on brownfield sites, not on greenfield sites, but brownfield sites where there's existing building, and adaptive reuse is one of the issues of how we can maintain identity. Because identity is not only form, as I said, is also appreciating proportions, the existing proportions, existing spaces, and existing orders. So you build forms on forms. So that's it. We like to just disregard the old forms and sweep it off or demolish it and build some sort of new form or new design that is not regarding the site specificities or the context specificities. So let us now go into the article, the said article. Now, please excuse me if I take a bit of time to explain this. The title is Architecture Design Has Lost Its Identity by Nur Atika Sulaiman and Elsie Gresela Ajos in the newspaper, online newspaper of Berita Harian or Daily News. There's a picture of the Twin Towers, Kuala Lumpur city. That's on the right, and also skyscrapers, and beyond that there is Kampong Baru. It's interesting that they have this view. Okay, so the caption for that says architecture that has the local identity on skyscrapers has begun to lose, or there's less of skyscrapers that have architectural identity of the local flavor. Well, if you're talking about 1980s and the Bang Bhumiputra and the postmodern era, then the debate is this person need to get into the architectural debate of what is happening now. But because this person may not come, the writer of this journal may not come from the architecture profession and merely reflecting some sentiments, and it could be some architects thinking about this as well, and the politicians maybe, or those looking into nationalistic agendas and of certain groups of people or background, then all right, we will talk to them. We will have the debate, because we will have the debate that is architecture is not about forms. And what is it in those forms that may soothe you, that may comfort you in terms of the urban design? Because you can't build high densities as you like and still is uncomfortable. The spaces are not comforting, or the spaces are not being what you call livable or habitable or easy accessible, safe and usable, because there are lack of public spaces. We're talking about public spaces. We're talking about spaces rather than just merely forms. So we can push back the debate. Why must we only receive this? That's why the public think that architects are just serving the client and the agenda of the client, which is mostly developers. And then after that, the public also think, oh, the architect's only thinking about designs that come from elsewhere and not really thinking about local architecture flavors. So if you don't push the debate to them, we're building urban design. We're looking into spaces that people would love, because maybe the spaces out there is not the spaces that people would love. Not good places, good public spaces where they enjoy. That's why they end up talking about the forms, because there's nothing else to discuss really. So here again, article said, still on skyscrapers in this country that was developed, and they maybe have unique designs, and you may look at the creativity of it. Is it to do with local architects that have designed this? What they see is modern, is a building that is too modern and too westernized and taken from other countries. And this is the criticism that some local architects are feeling. So when you look at the buildings being built now, what we would like to say is that this architecture now being built is something that you've seen designed from the West, from other countries. It's not something original from this country. So when a visitor comes to visit Kuala Lumpur, for example, they feel that this is not Kuala Lumpur. This doesn't feel like Kuala Lumpur because there's too many buildings that feel as if especially skyscrapers, that feel like the origination or the design comes from outside of Malaysia. So there is a quote from an architect in practice, who his name is Aziz, and is worried that architectural identity in this country will be lost and diminish, and the sense of Kuala Lumpur as a city is like any other city, ubiquitous in a way that if you go to any city, it doesn't have a sense of its own identity. So he further said that Malaysia have a lot of identities that you could use, such as the Malacca Sultanate identity, and you've been leaving that and not using that because although being for many hundreds of years that there is this sense of identity, why aren't you still using the Malacca Sultanate identity? So little by little, architecture will, with our identity or Malaysian identity, will be left, and there won't be any of the sense of local identity in our buildings. So some of the architects that are designing it is really good architecture, and it has some interesting characteristic. However, it's always being influenced by foreign architects. So it looks as if there is no inroads to this. Some manage to do something, but many are not very good at that. I mean, this is not a quote from that person, but I'm paraphrasing this. Therefore, they would like to do an exhibition of perpetual identity so that we can maintain the identity of Malaysian identity in the buildings. So therefore, UPM is doing that exhibition. So in this exhibition, it is not the first time that they're going to have to make aware for the youth who is interested to go into architecture to understand about identity in architecture. After 1980s, you see there's still references to 1980s. There have been several exhibitions, maybe more than three times, after we have achieved independence from the British in the late 1950s, which has been exhibited, which they had done before. So of these three exhibitions, it still haven't helped with the creativity of local architects in developing the identity of Malaysian architecture. So it's still lack of ideas, lack of creativity. A picture of the National Library, which is songket patterns on the pitch roofs, is shown here. So it's still about forms as usual. So there are 66 years of independence from the British, and we have to find one identity that is perpetual and not influenced by the British. So definitely what they're saying is that we don't want colonial architecture to be the identity. We're looking at Malay architecture. That's what the architect is saying here. A lot of identity is difficult to achieve because of some factors, including how people think with regard to the origin from the local characteristics. So we all have different thoughts about this, linking to our youth. So he refers to a lot about the Malay traditional houses and what do you call it? Around the Malay traditional houses, you have the there's a name for it, and I can't remember now, but the garden, home garden, yeah, where you have fruit trees and you have other things in it. So he's comparing it to now that you were staying in condominiums and apartments. So the identity or the way of life is different, and from then and now. And we have a lot of these forms, like the Perak House, the Johor, the Malacca, and all that. But when we design apartments, these forms are lacking in the architectural characteristics, hence lack of identity. Therefore, it's a big challenge for us to get this sort of architecture that explores identity. He says that when we design, it depends on whether people agree to our design or not. And perhaps it's not really appropriate for the future, or it's not according to taste. Of course, this identity is very fragile, as if it's like trends. Sometimes you like this style and this era, then you like that style and that era. I am agreeing as Azim Aziz in this regard, where old buildings, historical old buildings, also need to be maintained. Do not demolish existing building where we could save or preserve, and why do we get rid of the old identity and just replace with new identity? So, or some sort of a pastiche design where it looks like old design, historic building motifs or something, but recreated as if it's a new identity. When we talk about identity, I'm really wary about the word identity because it's like patterns. You can use the word patterns rather than identity, or motifs, and it'll be more specific to the discussion rather than waffling about. So I would be wary about using the word identity in everything. So his sentiment is on the preservation of old buildings. And there was issues regarding the government should give more chances, opportunities for local architects to design big projects, to show off the Malay identity, in particular, a Malaysian identity in its design. And this is what the sentiment of Haji Dar with regard to 2 billion ringgit project being given to foreign architect rather than local architects. And this issue has been raised since the 1970s, right after 20 years after, or 20 years or less after independence from the British. So why is it that foreign architects get to have the projects? Okay, so the last, well, I'm going to stop here reading this article. We get the sentiment of this article. The author of this article, although they're not non-architects, they were interviewing a couple of people to do this article. And it has been known that architects have been criticizing about foreign architects getting big projects, which is just from a well-known case is the recent building. I wouldn't touch this topic, but it was a Norman Foster building, and the owner of the building is a local person. And why did the owner of the building got the foreign architect to do that design? And is totally not in keeping with the identity, the Malaysian identity. Now, we're going in circles really with regard to Malaysian identity crisis now, because if it's since the 70s or 80s, that's about 40 years of just searching for the Malaysian identity. It's really about the government giving projects to foreign architects. The debate is that the government giving projects to foreign architects, in which the foreign architects will do a design that may not be showing an identity. So you know that star architects like Norman Foster or Zaha Hadid or all these, Bjarke Ingels or all these architects, they have their own style or signature design. They're not going to put something like the library design, the National Library design with a songket roof. So I would like to say that this is my opinion, totally my opinion, and the debate has to come into the arena of the public discussion with regard to identity. As somebody who teaches architectural theory for a number of years, I would like to make a contention that buildings such as the UTP Petronas building by Norman Foster, there are a few things that it's not that good in that building, like the birds nesting on top of this very high, difficult to maintain spaces, or those members up there next to the roof, and they had for some time have problems with birds shitting down on people. Sorry to say that word, but I can't think of anything else. Or having their feces falling on your face or something. But they have managed to resolve that. But what is nice about the UTP building, University Technology Petronas, is that is very breezy. It doesn't need air conditioning. You just use fans. Minimum amount of energy being used. It's open. It's like an umbrella. It's doing what it needs to do in a tropical climate. Just that the landscaping could be better. When I see it, that it could have better accessibility to the landscape area. But I mean, that is the building that I've been to, and which I could, as a user and someone with an architecture background, give a critical review of. And I think there's songket design as well in the auditorium, although it's is less obvious than the songket patterns on the roof. It's actually a very it's an architecture theory debate. If you're bringing this debate to get more funds or get the government to give contract to locally based architect, you are entitled to do so, because it's always an activism act that we need to fight for our cause, fight for the cause of the architect. But what I am disappointed is that the architecture fraternity doesn't defend all of our identities, and not only defending the Malay, Sultanate, Malacca identities. Because when you talk about identity, what is it? You're talking about forms and patterns. and finishes. You're not talking about space and the appreciation of certain space and certain building elements, such as the veranda, the balcony, and in apartment buildings. When you design the balcony, why is it 1.2 meters and it's not that functional in terms of the space? Why can't it be 1.5 meters, a little bit more? Why don't we debate about function more, about the use of space? I mean, we can sit on the floors in an apartment building we want, but the point of the matter is that the better design is designs that take into consideration the embellishment or the fenestration that is much more in keeping with the climate, for example, and all these other elements to do with sustainability in the real sense, not just add-ons, not just rainwater harvesting and solar panels. We're talking about much more comfortable and cheaper ways of saving the cost and also using materials that work. Architects only could deal with the design that's limited to what manufacturers or suppliers have in the market. And if it's too expensive, then that is too bad. But we want to design it cheaply, or, for example, the MK Tower or the Bata building is built by Kevin Matlow, in which tried to deal with those natural ventilation and use of cheaper materials. Of course, when you look at it now, it looks a bit run down, but then you have the brickwork, which is essentially something to be appreciated as well. It's not to do with the British colonial. Brickwork has happened even before that, right? Clay bricks. It's just that we were stuck in the sense of timber buildings. What is wrong in looking at our identity in terms of the future, in terms of creating a much more choices in terms of what material we can use, even for high-rise building. Experimentation in high-rise building in terms of identity, does it have to be exactly like the National Library and have a pitched roof? We're just looking at a certain type of design. And when we look at shopping malls, we know there's a lot of glass, there's a lot of the same design over and over again. Why are we looking at the forms again? Shopping mall is something that have the option to make it, the place would be much cheaper to maintain if it's much more open. Like Cheetah Mall, for example. Or some malls, before they going to put air conditioning in, which had water, which had rain coming in, but it could be better designed so that it won't be slippery and all. Of course, malls can get wet and can get a bit hectic, and you have to choose either or how you want to thematize it. So I've done as much as I could to say that identity must not be confused with patterns and forms. I'd like to say that identity is to do with existing building space, proportion system, the choice of material, the sensibilities of it being in a tropical country, more than just form making. So, thank you for listening and have a good day.